So as you guys know, I often make history videos, especially when it relates to sort of general politics happening at the moment and everything. But also sometimes I just like to point things out that people might not know, or start a conversation that people might not be having. And you know, some of you might have seen one of my videos a couple of months ago about how America inspired Nazi Germany, and I found that really interesting doing all the research for that. You know, how German judges and lawyers took what the Americans had done with their race laws and, you know, bring it back home to Nazi Germany to create, you know, their racist state and everything. And there's another sort of story I want to talk about in World War II, you've probably seen the thumbnail, but it's about the reasons why the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan specifically. So it is very complex, and there are a lot of arguments around this particular event in history, and I just want to kind of outline the whole scenario and then give my opinion on it. So of course, as we all know, part of World War II was the Allied fight against the Japanese, who were trying to expand their own empire in Asia at the expense of the French, of the Chinese, of the British, and of the Americans, and general other players in that area of the world. Now, it started as the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 when Japan invaded mainland China, and it can kind of be seen outside the realm of World War II to an extent, and throughout that conflict they displayed immense brutality, especially around the rape of Nanking, which, you know, a lot of people in Japan today still deny even happened. So obviously that's pretty brutal. And then throughout the war, you see in films, you read about it, the Japanese, because of their religion, you know, believing their emperor was their god, they would happily die for that. And it's sort of what you see today with Islamic fundamentalists, you know, a similar way, you know, Japanese pilots kamikazeing into American ships, you know, the Banzai charge, and it's sort of this whole ideology of death before dishonor. You know, the worst thing that can happen to you is be captured, so you might as well die and try and take out as many of the enemy as you can. And of course that is a very, very hard thing to deal with. So in that context, let's remember that context, the Allied fight against the Japanese was very brutal. In particular, the American fight against the Japanese, especially later on, whether that was Peleliu or Okinawa or Iwo Jima, where, you know, they suffered immense casualties, and the Japanese barely ever surrendered, so they had to root them out one by one, almost kill all of them. And they were so fanatical and suicidal in a lot of ways, it was so hard to deal with them. And of course the American war against the Japanese already inflamed and exacerbated America's own racial prejudice against Asians. But because of the fanaticism of the Japanese, you can understand that context why the atomic bomb sort of not had to be dropped, but it was the lesser of all the evils, because if the Americans invaded mainland Japan, millions would have died, millions more, because the Japanese probably wouldn't have surrendered, because they would probably think they could win still, and it's their home turf, and they were so fanatical in other parts of the world, you know, being at home, and all the civilians, they would probably get into the army to fight, and it would be like an absolute bloodbath. You probably can't imagine how many people would have died, you know, in general. You know, I'd say hundreds of thousands of Americans and British and Soviet troops would have died in that invasion. But you can't even imagine how many Japanese civilians would have died in that invasion. And this is always the argument that we've been fed since World War II, is that, you know, because of how many casualties we would have had to endure invading mainland Japan, the bomb was the only way. And, you know, killing about 150,000 Japanese in the blasts, that is a worthwhile sacrifice compared to the millions that probably would have died invading mainland Japan. And I generally think that is an argument that holds up, but I think the problem is that the whole picture has not been explored, because yeah, that is a fair enough argument, you know, you kill this many people to save this many people, and that sort of makes sense, especially given the context of the war. But there are a lot of other factors at play. So another one is the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan after the fall of Nazi Germany, and of course what was already taking shape after the fall of Nazi Germany was the Cold War. You know, the USSR had started setting up all these communist governments across Eastern Europe, and the West were aware of this. And, you know, a lot of people speculate that the reasons that the West and the Allies didn't invade France sooner is because they thought the Nazis and the Soviets would sort of cancel each other out. You know, their fight against each other would be so brutal that both sides would pretty much be destroyed at the end of it, because at the end of the day, the West, and especially Americans, hated communists just as much as fascists. And you could argue that Americans actually hated communists more than fascists when you see them ally with all the fascist dictators they did in the Cold War, whether that was Franco or people in South America. So there's that argument there. And of course, you know, they were dividing up Europe between themselves, and this whole new power dynamic was taking place where it wouldn't be the Allies versus the Axis anymore. It would be the Soviet Union versus America and its allies. So that's another dimension. So by the Americans dropping the bombs twice and getting the Japanese surrender, they were quickly able to mobilize and occupy mainland Japan and sort of make Japan an ally, because they got to write its constitution, they got to put American bases in Japan, and that cancels out the Soviets from getting a country and somewhere they could operate on which is quite close to America, and would be a good staging point for sort of an invasion and just dominating that area of the world. And of course you see in Asia what did happen. The Soviets helped set up, North Korea, and the North Korean government. They played a massive role in that. So you can see that is another argument for it, and that does come into play because a quick end to the war really benefited America because the Soviets were getting involved with the war against Japan. And you can see how the American empire's expansion sort of played into wanting a quick end to the war, because that part of Asia has always been of particular interest to the United States. I don't know how many of you have heard of gunboat diplomacy, where Japan in the 1860s said they wouldn't trade with America, so they sent like their navy to Japan with the threat of war, saying, you're going to open your ports to us. And what America always do is that they play Japan and China off each other. So when Japan is weaker, they side with Japan against China, and when China is weaker, they do it the other way around. So for example, they allied with Japan earlier, in World War I and everything. They were pretty good allies because China was stronger, and when Japan defeated China, it kind of reversed because they knew Japan was getting more powerful. So in World War II, you see America back China, but then straight afterwards, and China become communist and get more powerful and get more united, they back Japan again. And that's just how they always have played them off each other. And using the atomic bombs and, making this enemy a friend is just part of that policy. But here is the most interesting part I want to get into, and you've probably seen the thumbnail for this video. So it's about why the Americans would have never used a nuclear bomb on Europe, in particular Germany, and why they did use it on Japan. So as I said in my video about how America inspired Nazi Germany, America had insanely racist laws. And why that was different to other countries, say for example the UK or France, is that while these countries were pretty racist themselves, it wasn't enshrined in the law, where countries like America and South Africa did have racist laws. So for example, in the early 1900s, they outright banned Chinese immigration to America. Lots of other times, that they didn't allow Asian people to become US citizens, and everything like that. And it was super racist. And you can kind of imagine, because you see all the stuff with civil rights and everything in America in the 60s and 50s, and you see how racist it is. But I think something that gets left out a lot of the time is the way they treated Asians. And nothing shows this more but the fact that America put Japanese Americans in internment camps in World War II, 120,000 of them, and actor George Takei was actually in one himself when he was a child. Because Americans generally thought of non-white people as subhuman, they were way more suspicious of the Japanese. And I was saying Pearl Harbor and the way they fought in the war just added to this skepticism and added to this view that Japanese were alien and Japanese were subhuman to them. So yeah, they put them in concentration camps during the war. And on screen, I'm just going to put up some cartoons that were used as propaganda in the war to show you how they were depicted. The slant eyes, the buck teeth, the massive caricatures were employed against them, just to really reiterate that these people were subhuman. They were really like animals in a way to them, and how absolutely racist that was. And I think this points out that America wouldn't have used the A-bomb on Europe. And also another part of it is that Europeans are instrumental to American history, and especially in the foundation of it. So you have Germans, you have Slavs, you have various Italians and everything like that. So because they share this culture, and you can still see it today in places like New York, the different sort of neighborhoods all have an influence from different countries, whether that is Italians. Because it's such a multicultural place and they had their roots in Europe, it was never really going to use something like that on their own history. Because Americans were also very religious, so you had a lot of Protestants in America, so I doubt they were ever going to use the A-bomb on cities where, Protestant heroes were, like Martin Luther, for example, and a lot of their foundations of their religion. And there is a counter-argument to this. For example, everyone really knows about Dresden in World War II, when the RAF absolutely flattened it and killed, I think it was about 100,000 civilians, or maybe 90,000. And they're saying, if they would do that, why would they not use the atomic bomb? But I think because the atomic bomb essentially vaporized everything, civilians, people, equipment, and it would make places uninhabitable. So I think using that on a place that, they have links to, the Americans themselves, I think that wouldn't have really been an option for them. And because the Japanese were seen as subhuman and their culture was so alien, it wasn't really given a second thought. And I think American racism against Asians didn't really stop there. So for example, in the Vietnam War, the Americans dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than the amount of bombs dropped during the whole of World War II. They also used chemical weapons and used defoliant, which poisoned a lot of the farmland and poisoned a lot of people. And in Korea as well, you know, I think the American history with Asian people and how many wars and really brutal conflicts they fought against them has made them even more racist against them, and you can see that through their own history. So to really summarise, you know, it is a complicated issue, and there is no doubt in my mind that America, if it had it available, would not have used a nuclear bomb on Germany or Italy or anywhere like that because of the links they have with America and because of the racism and sort of the geostrategic implications of using these bombs. Using on Japan was far more palatable and there was less repercussions, and you know, no one would feel really bad about that because Japan would be so alien. And I think I've highlighted through this video just the way they were depicted in propaganda just made them seem more subhuman to Americans, and Pearl Harbor as well is just a cherry on top of that, to be like, you know, these nuclear bombs are just revenge for that and revenge for you starting the war on us. It is a pretty complex issue, so I wouldn't mind hearing other people's opinions in the comments. And if you like this sort of content, you can subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the Kavernacle. I have a WordPress, Kavernacle at WordPress, where I try and write one article a week. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.